I'm sure many of you have heard the story of the last samurai, but what about the last Japanese soldier? After Japan's defeat in the Second World War, the reformed Japanese constitution forbids the nation from having a military. The closest thing to a military modern Japan has is its self-defense force, which as the name implies is strictly for self-defense and disaster support in the case of large-scale natural disasters. Because the self-defense force has little offensive capabilities, it is not considered a military, and its members are not considered soldiers. Going by this logic, one would assume Japanese soldiers went extinct in 1945, when Japan lost the Second World War, but this is not exactly the case. Even after the war officially ended, there were many Japanese soldiers holding out in the jungles of Southeast Asia, not knowing Japan had lost the war. The story I will present to you today is about a man who survived close to 30 years in the jungles of the Philippines, dutifully carrying out his mission long after the world had returned to peace. This is the story of Onoda Hiroo. Onoda was born in 1922 as the fourth son of his family. After graduating middle school, he would join a trading company where he would learn English and Chinese. In 1942, at the age of 20, he was drafted into the army to serve his country in the Second World War. Onoda applied to be trained as an officer and would also be accepted into a school to train commando units. This was a highly selective course, but he was accepted due to his high intelligence and proficiency in foreign languages. In this school, he would learn the techniques of espionage and guerrilla warfare. According to his fellow classmates, he was extremely hardworking and harbored a fierce loyalty and sense of duty for his country. This commando school was unique not only in the methods of warfare they taught, but also the mentality they drove into their students. The general doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army was to never surrender, but many soldiers would realize this through ending themselves or committing to hopeless banzai charges to avoid capture or surrender. In contrast, the school Onoda attended told its students to never throw away their lives meaninglessly, do everything possible to survive, and therefore be able to carry out their mission longer, to inflict maximum damage on the enemy. By the time Onoda graduated as a junior officer, the war was going very poorly for Japan, and organization throughout the army was deteriorating. He was hastily sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines, where he was supposed to train other soldiers stationed there in guerrilla warfare to prolong the advance of the Allies. However, when he arrived on December 31st, 1944, the battalion stationed on Lubang, nor the division who oversaw the region, were informed of this new strategy, and opted to go for the more traditional decisive battle doctrine. Because he was only a junior officer, Onoda didn't have much say, and could not train his men in the ways of guerrilla warfare before the Allies arrived. On February 28, 1945, a force of over 1,000 Americans landed on Lubang, opposed to 200 Japanese. The Japanese could only hold out for 3 days, until the commanding officer gave out the order to disperse into the jungle in small teams. Onoda and 3 of his men ran into the heart of Lubang Island, where they would live off palm fruits, bananas, and every once in a while poach cattle for meat. Because the rain season began, and the Americans had little incentive to comb through the jungle to find just a few stragglers, Onoda and his team were left alone for the remainder of the war. The Second World War officially ended on August 15, 1945, but this news would not reach Onoda nor other soldiers hiding in the islands across the Pacific. Local authorities would often broadcast through loudspeaker that the war was over, and also scatter flyers via airdrop over the jungle, stating that any remaining soldiers would be returned to Japan unharmed. But to Onoda, this seemed like a trap set by the Americans. He would recall what he learned in commando school, survive as long as possible, and inflict as much damage as possible. So that's what he did. He would continue to raid and sabotage facilities the American military set up in Lubang, and gather intel for when the Japanese would someday make a counteroffensive and take back the Pacific Islands. Their sabotage efforts would go virtually unchecked for 5 years, but one day one of Onoda's men got separated from the group and was captured by the Americans. When that man was sent back to Japan and found out that the war really was over, he told authorities in Japan that Onoda and 2 others were still on the island. But because the political situation regarding the Philippines were unstable at the time, no search effort could be conducted. In 1954, Onoda and his men would have a gunfight with the local police, resulting in one of his men fatally wounded. Now it was just a team of two, stranded in an island with no realistic plan to ever escape. Around this time, Onoda would get his hands on a radio and created a makeshift antenna to amplify the signals he could receive. This allowed him to listen into broadcasts from far away. Listening to radio broadcasts from Japan, Onoda would learn that Japan was now a prosperous nation, even being able to host the Summer Olympics in 1964. But he assumed Japan had become a puppet state of the United States, and because he believed Japan would never have surrendered willingly, the Japanese government must be existing somewhere in exile, maybe in Korea or China. In the early 50s, seeing American warplanes head in the general direction of Japan and Korea, Onoda assumed that the Japanese government in exile must still be holding strong, when in reality the American planes were heading for the Korean War. In the 60s and 70s, seeing the American planes head towards Vietnam, Onoda assumed that the Japanese were making a counteroffensive into Southeast Asia, when in reality the American planes were heading for the Vietnam War. Although incorrect in his assumptions, this would revive his hopes that Japan finally was taking back the Pacific Islands. However, in 1972, he would have yet another run-in with the local police. In the resulting gunfight, he would lose his last comrade, who he had been living with for almost 30 years now. Onoda would later claim this event would not discourage him, but rather motivate him to continue his survival, to someday avenge his fallen comrades. The death of a Japanese soldier in this gunfight was big news in both the Philippines and Japan, as the final casualty of the Pacific War. And a large-scale search effort was finally organized to find Onoda. Onoda was actually aware of this search effort, and as the men and vehicles moved through the jungle, he would watch from the shadows. But from his perspective, this was yet another trap set up by the Americans, and would never reveal himself. Things would change when a 23-year-old adventurer by the name of Suzuki came to Lubang in search of Onoda. Suzuki hypothesized that Onoda would never hand himself in to an armed search party, and ventured into the jungle alone, camping out in the open to make sure Onoda was aware of his presence. Just as he thought, Onoda appeared out of the jungle one day, holding Suzuki at gunpoint. Suzuki told him that the war was over, and he is now free to come back to Japan. Onoda initially suspected Suzuki to be some kind of spy, but looking at his attire and demeanor, decided to give the young man a chance. The two of them would proceed to discuss what happened to Japan after 1945 throughout the night. And by daybreak, Suzuki had successfully persuaded Onoda that what he says was true. Onoda would be willing to surrender, under one condition. It would have to be a direct order from his former superior officer, Major Taniguchi. Suzuki promises to find and bring Taniguchi to Lubang in the near future, and the two of them take a photo together and go their separate ways. As promised, Suzuki would track down and bring Taniguchi to the island the following month, and the former major would give Onoda the order to terminate his mission. The war was over. Upon hearing this, Onoda would turn himself in to the local authorities on March 10, 1974, almost 30 years since he initially arrived on Lubang. Something to note is that when meeting Taniguchi, Onoda would give a detailed debriefing regarding the American military bases on the island, such as where they are located, what is the base's purpose, and how many people are stationed there, indicating that Onoda really had been carrying out his mission for 3 decades. In those 30 years, Onoda had killed or injured roughly 30 policemen, soldiers, and local citizens. He was expecting to be sentenced to death, but the Philippine president of the time pardoned Onoda, as he was not a murderer, rather a soldier, carrying out his mission. The Japanese government would later pay the Philippines 300 million yen as consolation. Pardoned of his crimes, Onoda returned to Japan, but he was unable to adapt to life there. Cameras would follow him everywhere, and media helicopters would hover around his house. After spending so much time in solitude, Constantly being the subject of attention was uncomfortable, and the sounds of helicopters caused flashbacks of enemy aircraft flying overhead. Within just 1 year of returning to Japan, he would leave for Brazil in 1975, where his brother had a ranch of 1,200 hectares, or roughly 3,000 acres. The next year in 1976, a Japanese woman would visit Onoda in Brazil, and would eventually become his wife. Together with his wife and his brother's family, they would turn the ranch into a prosperous business, with thousands of cattle. Onoda would eventually return to Japan in the mid-1980s, and by then the hype around him had died down, allowing him to pursue various activities. In 1984, he would establish the Onoda Nature School, where he would teach children the methods of surviving in the wilderness. He would write books, becoming a best-selling author, and would also participate in politics, serving his country until the very end. Suzuki, the young man who had convinced Onoda to come back to Japan, passed away in 1986, aged just 37, while attempting to traverse the Himalayas. Onoda would later go visit Suzuki's resting place to pay his respects. In 1996, Onoda would visit Lubang one last time, touring the island he had spent 30 years on. If you go to the island today, there is a hiking trail named after Onoda, and you can go visit the caves he spent during his time there. In January of 2014, Onoda Hiroo passed away due to pneumonia, at 91 years of age. What do you think of Onoda and his life? Was he an honorable hero, loyal to his country? Or was he more of a zealot that went too far, harming dozens of people unnecessarily? Let me know in the comments below. A big thank you to Korbachu and my other Patreons for supporting this channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. As always, thank you for watching until the end. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. I'll see you next time.